She was cooking alone in the kitchen, until the cowboy crossed by and stopped when he heard her humming. Witness this unbelievable true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The air in Willow Creek, Texas, always carried a kind of golden silence at sunset. The sky stretched wide, brushed in amber and peach tones that melted into the dusty horizon. On a small ranch just outside town, a woman named Maggie Dawson was cooking alone in her kitchen, as she had done almost every evening for the past 2 years. The kitchen was simple, built in the 1960s, with faded white cabinets and a window that looked out onto the front porch. Through it, you could see the dry fields, the weathered fence posts, and the oak tree that had stood longer than any memory in the Dawson family. Maggie stirred a pot of chili on the stove, her rhythm slow and steady, her hands moving with practiced ease. Every so often, she wiped her palms on her apron, leaned back, and hummed a tune, soft, low, familiar. It was an old folk song her mother used to sing while cooking Sunday dinner. A tune that held both comfort and longing. She didn't know why she kept humming that song. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was hope, maybe it was just a way to fill the silence. The radio in the corner hadn't worked in months. The clock above it ticked softly, each second echoing in the quiet house. The smell of onions, chili powder, and slow-cooked beef filled the room. Outside, the wind picked up dust from the fields, and somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed. Life had been quiet for Maggie since her husband, Earl Dawson, passed away. He had been the kind of man who filled every room with noise, laughter, stories, songs, and the sound of his boots on the floorboards. When he was gone, the house had grown too still, too large for one woman to fill. But Maggie had kept on, as country women often did. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended to the small vegetable garden out back, and she kept the ranch books like Earl had taught her. And every evening, when the sun began to fade and the air turned cool, she would hum. That evening, as she stirred the chili, she paused for a moment and looked out the window. The wind had changed. It carried a faint rustle, the sound of hooves against gravel. Maggie squinted through the glass. A lone rider was passing down the road, his hat pulled low, his silhouette framed against the fading sky. Cowboys weren't unusual around Willow Creek. The town was surrounded by ranches and cattle trails, but something about this man made her stop for a moment longer. The rider slowed his horse near her front gate, his head tilted slightly as if he'd caught something in the air. Maggie didn't realize that her humming, carried by the open window, had reached him. She went back to stirring, not knowing that the sound of her voice had made a stranger stop in his tracks. The cowboy, whose name was Maddox, was a man used to silence. He worked the open ranges for weeks at a time, riding fence lines, mending gates, moving cattle from one pasture to another. His life was the land, quiet, endless, lonely. But when he heard that humming, something stirred inside him. It wasn't just the melody, it was the feeling behind it. It reminded him of a time long before the miles, before the long days, before loss had settled in his chest like a stone. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He wasn't sure what he was doing, maybe just curious, maybe hungry, or maybe just drawn by something he couldn't name. The front porch creaked as he stepped onto it. Through the open window, he saw her, a woman with silver strands in her brown hair, sleeves rolled up, moving around the kitchen like she belonged there, like she belonged everywhere she touched. Maggie turned when she heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. Her first instinct was to reach for the old shotgun that hung by the door, but when she saw the man's kind eyes through the screen, she relaxed. "Evenin'," she called, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Can I help you with something?" Cole removed his hat respectfully and nodded. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to intrude. Just ridin' by and heard you're singin'. Reminded me of home, I guess." She chuckled softly. "Well, I'm not much of a singer, but I appreciate the compliment." Her voice had a warmth to it, the kind of tone that made strangers feel like old friends. He smiled faintly. "You're doing better than most radio stations have heard out here." That earned a laugh. "Well, you're welcome to sit a spell if you're not in a rush. Chili's near ready, and I reckon there's more than enough for two." For a moment, Cole hesitated. He wasn't used to invitations, not anymore. But something about the smell from the kitchen and the kindness in her tone made it hard to refuse. He tied his horse to the post and stepped inside. The air in the kitchen was warm, filled with the scent of home-cooked food and something deeper, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He took off his gloves and stood awkwardly near the door until she gestured for him to sit at the small wooden table. "You from around here?" she asked, ladling chili into 2 bowls. "Born a few counties north," he said, resting his hat on his knee. "Been workin' the Maddox ranch most my life. Guess I'm just passin' through tonight." "Well, Cole Maddox," she said with a small smile, "you've found yourself at the Dawson place. And since you're here, you might as well eat." They sat across from each other, 2 people whose paths were never meant to cross, yet somehow had. Outside, the crickets began their nightly song. Inside, spoons clinked softly against the bowls. The food was simple, hearty, and good. Cole hadn't tasted anything like it in a long while. "This is real fine chili, ma'am," he said after a moment. "Thank you. Learned from my mother. She always said the secret's in the slow simmer." Maggie smiled, but her eyes softened, the way eyes do when memories come uninvited. Cole noticed. "You been here long?" "All my life. My husband and I ran the ranch together. Been quiet since he passed." He nodded slowly. "Sorry to hear that," she shrugged gently. "It's life. You learn to live with the quiet. Though I suppose the humming helps." That made him smile again. "Well, ma'am, I reckon it does. It sure made me stop." The words hung between them for a moment, simple, honest, heavy in their own way. They talked until the sky outside turned indigo. Maggie told stories about Willow Creek, about the summers when the river would flood and the winters that froze the fences. Cole shared tales from the trail, long rides, wild storms, and the beauty of open country when the sun came up over the plains. It was the kind of conversation that felt timeless, the kind where laughter replaced years of silence. When he finally stood to leave, the air had turned cool. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Didn't think I'd find good chili and good company today." "You're welcome anytime, Mr. Maddox," she said softly, standing by the door. "Though next time, I expect you to knock before sneakin' around my porch." He grinned. "Fair enough." She watched as he mounted his horse and rode off into the fading twilight. The sound of hooves grew fainter until it disappeared altogether, leaving only the night sounds, the wind, the crickets, and her quiet humming once more. As she closed the door, Maggie found herself smiling without realizing it. It had been a long time since someone had shared her table, a long time since she'd heard laughter echo through that kitchen. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. She went back to the stove, humming again, not out of habit, but out of something warmer. Something new. Outside, the Texas night spread wide and dark, and somewhere on the trail, Cole Maddox glanced back toward the small ranch house. He could still hear that soft tune in his mind, the one that had stopped him on the road and somehow, in a quiet, unexplainable way, changed something in him. And neither of them knew it yet, but that simple moment, a cowboy stopping to listen to a woman's song, was just the beginning of something neither had expected, a whisper from the past that would soon bring their lives back to life. The next morning came soft and quiet over Willow Creek. The sunlight slipped gently through the curtains of Maggie Dawson's kitchen, turning everything golden again, the jars on the shelves, the copper pots hanging near the stove, even the dust that floated lazily in the air. Maggie poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. The old oak outside was swaying slightly, its leaves whispering against the breeze. For a long while, she simply watched the empty road. It had been years since she'd had a visitor who wasn't family or the mailman. And now, she couldn't stop thinking about that cowboy, Cole Maddox. His voice, calm and polite. His eyes, steady but kind. The way he'd sat at her table like he belonged there, even though they'd only just met. It wasn't romance she felt exactly, not yet, but something else. Something rare, a flicker of connection she hadn't felt since her husband passed. She brushed the thought away and set her cup down. "Don't be foolish, Maggie," she muttered softly to herself. He was just being polite. Still, she couldn't help humming the same tune again as she started preparing breakfast. Old habits, she figured. Or maybe the memory of company made her heart lighter that morning. Meanwhile, miles down the road, Cole Maddox was riding the fence line of his employer's ranch. The sun was already high, and the air shimmered with heat. But his mind wasn't on his work. Every time he looked toward the open plain, he could see that little ranch in his thoughts, the white house, the smoke from the chimney, the woman at the stove humming like the world hadn't broken her spirit. He'd spent years moving from one place to another, never staying long enough for anything to take root. But now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself wondering what it might feel like to stay. For 2 days, life carried on as usual. Maggie baked bread, tended her chickens, and kept herself busy. Yet, every time a horse passed on the road, she found herself glancing toward the window. And every night, when she sat at the kitchen table alone, she caught herself looking at the chair he'd sat in, like it still held the warmth of his presence. On the third evening, just as the sun was dipping low and painting the horizon orange, she heard it again, the sound of hooves on gravel. Her heart lifted before her mind could catch up. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and there he was. Cole Maddox, hat tipped low, reins loose in his hands, smiling in that quiet way that spoke more than words. "Evenin', Miss Dawson," he said. "Evenin', Mr. Maddox," she replied, smiling. "You passin' by again, are you lookin' for more chili?" He chuckled. "Reckon I wouldn't turn down a bowl if you're offerin'." She laughed, that warm, soft sound that filled the air like sunlight. "Well, come on in then. I just baked some cornbread too. Go with it." That night was easier than the last. They talked more freely, about small things, mostly. The price of feed, the weather, the way folks in town were always talking about someone else's business. Maggie found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in years, and Cole noticed how the lines around her eyes softened when she smiled. When he left that night, the stars were bright overhead, scattered like diamonds across the sky. He lingered by his horse for a moment, looking back at her porch light before riding away. Something about that little house made him feel like the world wasn't so lonely anymore. The visits became a quiet pattern. Some weeks he'd stop by for supper, other times just to bring her things she needed from town, sugar, flour, sometimes even wildflowers he'd picked on the trail. Maggie always pretended not to notice the flowers, but she'd put them in a jar on the window every time. Over the next few months, their friendship grew naturally, like grass after the rain. They talked about the past, about losses and lessons, about how life had a way of carrying on no matter how broken it got. Maggie learned that Cole had lost his little sister years ago in a storm, a memory that still haunted him. And Cole learned that Maggie had once dreamed of traveling beyond Texas, but love and land had tied her roots deep in Willow Creek. It wasn't romance that brought them together at first, it was understanding. The kind only people who'd known quiet grief could share. One late autumn evening, as the first chill crept into the air, Maggie found herself humming again while washing dishes. Cole was fixing the broken hinge on her barn door, and she could hear him working outside. The sound of hammering mixed with the fading hum of her song. It was a small, ordinary moment, yet somehow, it felt extraordinary. When he came inside, his hands were rough and cold from the wind. She handed him a mug of hot coffee. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Didn't mind," he replied. "Besides, I can't stand seeing things left broken." Their eyes met for just a second, and something passed between them, quiet, unspoken, and deep. Maggie looked away first, pretending to fuss with the pot on the stove. That winter was colder than most. The wind howled through the plains, and nights seemed endless. But somehow, neither of them felt it as sharply as before. Cole started spending more evenings at the Dawson place, helping with repairs, feeding the horses, sometimes just sitting at the table while she cooked. He never overstayed, never crossed the line between comfort and intrusion. But the silence they shared began to feel more like peace than loneliness. One night, after a long day of snow and hard work, Maggie noticed him staring out the window. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "About how some folks cross paths for reasons they don't understand. And maybe that's God's way of giving us another chance to feel alive." Maggie's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. She understood perfectly. By spring, the fields had turned green again. The air smelled of rain and new life. The town folks had begun to notice, of course, how the widow Dawson had company now and how the quiet cowboy from the Maddox ranch seemed to have found a reason to smile more often. Willow Creek had a way of turning whispers into stories faster than the wind carried dust, but neither Cole nor Maggie paid much attention. They'd both lived long enough to know that people would talk no matter what. Then, one evening in late April, everything changed. A storm rolled in fast, the kind that turned the sky black and the wind wild. Maggie was trying to close the shutters when she saw a figure riding hard through the rain. It was Cole, soaked to the bone, his horse nearly exhausted. She threw the door open as he reached the porch. "Cole, "What on earth are you doin' riding out in this weather?" "Fence down on the north side," he said breathlessly. "Cattle spooked. Came to warn you, some might have broken through your line too." Before she could answer, thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground. Cole grabbed her arm and pulled her inside as lightning split the sky. For a moment, the world outside vanished into a roar of wind and rain. They stood in the kitchen, dripping wet, hearts pounding. He looked at her, the flicker of lantern light reflecting in her eyes, and something inside him broke open. "Maggie," he said softly, his voice rough. "I ain't never been much for words, but I reckon I'd regret it the rest of my life if I didn't say this. Meeting you, it changed me. You made me remember what it feels like to come home." For a long second, she said nothing. The storm outside raged, wind howling against the windows. Then she stepped closer, her hand finding his. "And you," she whispered, "you made me remember what it feels like to live again." Neither of them needed more words. The storm passed that night, but something else settled, quiet and steady, like a promise. From then on, Cole never rode by without stopping. Some days, he helped with the ranch work. Other days, they just sat on the porch, talking until the stars came out. Maggie kept humming, and he'd sometimes join in with a low whistle. By summer, the once lonely house on the edge of Willow Creek no longer felt empty. The sound of laughter returned. The scent of coffee and cornbread drifted out the windows in the mornings, and the neighbors began to say that the old Dawson place had come alive again. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, travelers passing down that long country road could still hear it, a faint humming carried through the air, soft and sweet, followed by the echo of a cowboy's laughter. It wasn't a grand love story, not the kind found in books. It was something simpler, truer, two hearts finding peace in the quiet corners of life. Because sometimes, all it takes is a song, a stranger, and a single moment of stillness on a country road to change everything.